Okay, so part two, New 302. This originally being attached to March 18th, as I already mentioned. Okay, so part one, as I mentioned, crossroads. I think I have elaborated that sufficiently. But the second part that I wanted to talk about was this question of helpers, allies. Now, when we looked at Daniel's, the watchword matrix, that top right position within the rectangle, what I call the annular archetypes, ring shaped, right? But the top, it's a square, but they're eight. The top right position, right, is this the helper or the imago, and in Star Wars terms, not always useful because I recognize not everybody knows Star Wars the way that they used to, but in the top right position, we can think of that helper position as being the droids, right? C3PO and R2D2. And we can think of them in sort of counterpoint in two directions, right? In the horizontal dimension, they're counterpoint to the guide, right? Where the guide is the inner figure, right? That's Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars terms. The inner figure who is that kind of moral compass, that sense of conscience, right? Sense of guidance. So opposed in the horizontal dimension to the guide, and opposed in the vertical dimension to the skeptic or the tyrant, right? In Star Wars, this is Han Solo. And we can kind of localize this a little bit, right? So if we think about the guide versus the helper, then we look at it basically in terms of both the orientation towards oneself as a psychic figure, but also the kind of action. So the guide stands in something of a superior position to the ego, right? The guide advises the ego and is a moral compass to the ego, right? It's the Jiminy Cricket, right, that says good things. It's the angel on the shoulder. It's the better nature, right? Trust your feelings, use the force, Luke, etc. Right? And notably, the guide, of course, is not a figure that directly intervenes typically. More, it gives advice, right? In Star Wars, we see this quite specifically because after a certain point, Obi-Wan Kenobi sort of sacrifices himself to delay the antagonist, the tempter, the demon, Vader, right? And then is gone. But he isn't gone. He's transformed, right, into a more inner figure, right, into a representation of this inner space, such that when Luke is making his run on the Death Star, if you've not seen this movie, you really should. It's super. It's really young. When he just hears Obi-Wan Kenobi's voice, use the Force, Luke, trust your feelings. It's a voice, but it is a superior kind of voice, right? It's a superior kind of voice. The helper, in contrast, is sort of looks up to the ego, right? And so we see this with the droids, right? They sort of follow what Luke says unwaveringly, but they also look up to him with this tremendous adoration. They're like pets that way, right? Master, they call him, right? A sort of thing that we often attribute to dogs, right? We attribute to dogs this concept that they think of us as master. And that does seem to be kind of, right, with a relatively well-trained dog anyway, that, we're sort of taking the lead. They're in this support position. Like, they're buddies, but they're auxiliary. They're there to help, right? Very much what we see in the historical record, incidentally, around the domestication of dogs, which is that the two great technological advances that our particular branch of early humanity seems to have really nailed down over our competitors were the use of thin, short spears that could be flung with the atl, right? The spear launcher. It's kind of a curved thing that looks like a shoehorn, and you can use it to extend, of course, the leverage of your arm to launch a small spear at a great distance, as opposed to like the thick-hafted thrusting spear where you have to get in close, which you do not want to do with a large herbivore. When you look at the patterns in, I think, Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals, you find lots of bone breaks in their skeletons, healed often, that are consistent with the sorts of bone breaks you see in like rodeo clowns and bucking bronco riders, right? People who are in close proximity to large, pissed off herbivores. So using a hunting spear, you got to get in close, right? Using a throwing spear, right? This is our great innovation in a way, right? That we throw like no other species, right? And you throw at a distance. Those suckers are powerful too. There was a scientist who was sort of retesting the autolysis mechanism and could put one of these small spears straight through a goat carcass, through it. So it's tremendously powerful even at a distance and can be quite accurate if you're trained. That's one innovation. But the other innovation, of course, was we domesticated dogs. And having a bunch of domesticated dogs that understand pack structure, it's like if I eat, you eat, is the basic arrangement, right? But also, of course, we've co-evolved to love each other. So if we make eye contact with our dog, we get a burst of wonderful, oxytocin, fuzzy oxytocin. But the dog also gets a burst of oxytocin when it makes eye contact with us. Like, we are really co-evolved in this way. So these are sort of the two great innovations, right? Which is we harry prey with dogs, harry and herd them with dogs, and we have, right, launching. So the dog as helper. Now, in Star Wars, right, they look up to, and you'll notice when you look at the watchword, right, that the sort of formal position that Daniels assigns for that is the imago, right? It's sort of the highest version of the external self, right? Our best selves in some very external way, right? Higher than basic persona, like this driven thing. And I think that those two interpretations are consonant. On one hand, that is the location where we ourselves find that version of ourself, like this is my best external self, right? But also, it's the piece of us that looks up to us in that way, right? It looks up to us in that way, right? So both of those are kind of located there, okay, that axis. And the point is that it acts, it follows our orders, it pitches in, it does things for us. If you think about the droids in Star Wars, R2-D2 is always intervening and unlocking doors and doing stuff, right? C-3PO, although he's pretty nervous, nevertheless is like a tremendous translator and can undertake certain kinds of actions. It's often something of a lookout. They help directly. They're helpers, okay? As opposed to the guide, who is more of an advice giver, right? Nobody sits around taking advice from R2-D2. Hey, what do you think we should do, R2? That's not what happens. R2 is more active. He pitches in, right? Okay, now look at the correspondence to the skeptic, or the tyrant, or the specter, as it is sometimes called in the core Daniels material. So there we've got Han Solo. And so what's the deal with Han Solo? Well, Han Solo's whole role for most of that film is to doubt and oppose, right? No matter what anybody says, Han Solo doubts it and opposes it. Geez, I don't think so. That's never going to work. I got an awfully big imagination. Why should I do this? You know what, kid? Blah, 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 blah. He's very skeptical, right? He sort of opposes the ego. Every time the ego starts to get in, Han Solo comes in and lets the air out. Right up, I add, until the end, where Han Solo transitions into being a helper, which I think is a big part of the sort of emotional, dramatic pull of that scene, that Han Solo becomes a supportive helper, right? He swoops in at the last second, directly helps, and then is incredibly encouraging. And that shift over, because the other helpers have been sort of disabled and removed from play, right? It's part of the emotional charge that people get in that scene. We've talked about that. But the point is, you again have this opposition, whereas the helper and the helper looks up to us and acts in this way, right? It supports us, right? So it looks up and it supports us and encourages and supports, agrees and supports. The skeptic slash tyrant slash specter, right, does the opposite. It tears down, it opposes, it resists. Now, obviously, that is not intrinsically bad, right? That particular role. In fact, it's important to have a kind of internal dialectic, provided that it doesn't get out of control. It's not good, generally speaking, to have completely unchallenged patterns of thought. As I've said many times, I think the possibility of people locking into a kind of unchallenged pattern of thought tends to render them psychologically quite brittle, right? They lose a flexibility, right? And it makes, of course, people incredibly prone to certain kinds of cognitive biases, right? They get tons of confirmation bias, and they tend to sort of lock in and find this inability to see things outside their current perspective, right? That renders them inflexible, because, as we've discussed many times, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. So anything that's got a positive aspect, there's an equal number of circumstances where it's a detriment. If it's a heuristic here, If there are an equal number of conditions where it's a bias. And so you want to have a kind of interior figure that challenges you. You know, you think about it when you're writing a paper, and I've said this many times, but when you're constructing an argument in a paper, when you're constructing an argument generally, you want to have that aspect of challenge. You want to play chess against yourself. Construct your argument as best you can, but then turn the board around and play as the other side. Try to knock it down, right? How would I attack this? Doing so only strengthens your argument, but you also have to be receptive to the idea that your argument might change, right? You have to be receptive to the idea that things may need to change for you to, right, address those concerns. If you dismiss those concerns out of hand, right, then you know you're in a very inflexible position, and frankly, like leaving your argument open to all kinds of criticisms and problems, right? You render it brittle. This is the case when you're writing a paper. It is also, of course, the case when you're making really any kind of other decision. You want to be considering counterpoint, and to do that, there has to be a kind of skepticism and opposition that you're relying on in some sense. Now, the you know, when I was talking about this relative to crossroads, right? I talked in that last lecture about reaching out to a wide variety of people in order to get their take, and what I specifically wanted was, what am I not thinking about, right? What are the emphases that I'm not thinking about? I wanted to be challenged in a certain kind of way, and I tried to remain maximally open to those positions, right? When people were telling me things, even things that I didn't want to hear, I tried to remain really open to it, because I had a recognition that the fact that I was wrestling so much with it meant that there were things that I was missing and things that I needed to be challenged on. So I invited the challenge, right? Not that it was easy to do. It generally isn't. So there is something to be said for having that kind of resistance, having a faculty that resists and interrogates and questions, provided it doesn't get out of hand. Because as with all these things, you know, you're swimming in a balance. It's very possible for that piece to become massively overactive, and then, of course, you go into a state of, like, radical, terrifying, anxious uncertainty, right? And that is the kind of state that, as often as not, tends to cause people to then snap into a sort of pseudo-certainty, to grab onto whatever piece of, you know, driftwood is left over from the wreckage, and, right? Even though that may not be sort of optimal in some sense. So it's very possible for that thing to get overactive. If you've ever had the experience of being caught in a kind of like questioning loop, you can realize how terrible and corrosive this is. So I have, on a few occasions, really been immersed into the kind of, you know, Humean, like David Hume, the sort of Humean metaphysic of skepticism, where it's like, what do I know? What do I know? What do I know? And every time you know, positive thought comes up, I would come at it. This piece of my mind would come at it. Yeah, but you don't know that. You don't know that. You don't know that. Right? This really radical uncertainty, right? Like Socratic aporia, right? The Socratic method, asking questions until you realized that you were in a contradiction, the aporia, the opening up that is caused by that. But of course, if you have that, I mean, there's a reason that they killed Socrates, which is that stuff pisses people off. It makes them uncomfortable, right? Makes them deeply, deeply uncomfortable. And if you are doing it to yourself all the time, it just renders you a paralyzed wreck if you're not in control of it. This is Hamlet. It's Hamlet's problem, right? It's like, well, you could look at it this way, and you could look at it this way, and it's like, right, he's caught in this loop of just constantly, like, you can look at it all these different ways and unable to act, unable to settle on a position and move ahead. So there is a kind of balance that you have to strike between these things. Now, it's not that I don't think that that's a useful thing, and I've made clear many times that I think that there is an enormous value to cultivating a secure sense of uncertainty. A secure sense of uncertainty, right? This is what epistemic humility is about, or radical epistemic humility is, like recognizing how little you know. And when you try to boil things down to the real essentials of what you know, it's a pretty small set, right? And yet, despite the fact that that is fundamental to sort of your approach to the world, that things are incredibly difficult to truly know, we act, We do things all the time on very piecemeal information, and we act, for the most part, largely successfully, right? We're the end result of many, 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 many thousands of generations of beings that have acted on imperfect information and yet managed to kind of stumble forward at high speed. So there's a way to do it, right? You can cultivate this deep sense of uncertainty, right? This deep sense of like release and the epistemic humility without, always falling into that like Humean corrosion. Although for what it's worth, I think being bathed in the Humean corrosion itself is quite useful sometimes. Like I think dissolving away your premises and dissolving away, right, so that you experience something radically other at some sense. This is one of the great benefits, I believe anyway, of the mystical experience, is that it dissolves so powerfully some of the core assumptions, right? And very often within mystical experiences, spontaneous or induced, one of the things that people report is a deep sense of certainty on one level, but also a kind of like, oh, like it's really not what I thought. Like so much of this is me bringing it, it's decisions I'm making about the way I'm going to see things, about the way I'm seeing myself, about the way that I'm seeing the world, right? Like there are choices here. There's so many ways to be, right? So having that occasional experience is good, but the helper, on the other hand, is about these principles of support, right? And like assistance. It looks up to us and it supports us. Now, what does that mean when we're talking about it, sort of psychologically, archetypally? You kind of have some sense of it there, but let me give you an interesting example. So yesterday, a client of mine brought a dream. This is a client who hasn't brought dreams. They've been very interested in that potential, but they themselves, they don't have dream recollection. They don't have strong dream recollection. They sort of report that they don't dream. And when we've talked about it a few times, right, sometimes they get a bit irate. And indeed, when we've discussed certain things like lucid dreaming, they were actually highly, highly skeptical of the existence of lucid dreaming. They just didn't really believe it was a thing. Despite me saying, well, like I personally have extensive experience with lucid dreams, but also there's a lot of well-grounded science. And they were like, no, that's not a thing. It's like, okay, that's interesting. Very strong resistance. And this is not a person who had a strong connection to their dream life. And so it was quite striking because they showed up to session and they were like, clearly kind of charged up, and they were like, I had a dream. And it's true. It was very much a like ripped from the textbook kind of dream. So the opening scene of this dream is the thing that primarily concerns me, because in our context here, because in the opening scene of the dream, they're younger. They're sort of a young adult, 19 or 20. They're living back in the parental home. And they're outside and they're playing with somebody who is yet younger, like 14, 15, 12, 13, 14, 15, not entirely clear, but like somebody who's younger than they are. They're playing with this kid. And there is a storm drain, like a sewer drain, outside the house, which has been covered with a big concrete block. And the start of the dream, right, so that it's inaccessible, and at the start of the dream, the client is like, well, I knew that there was something down there and it was like haunted, right? But you couldn't get at it because of this block. But I spoke to this kid that I was playing with, and I was like, I think together we can move the block and get down there. And so indeed, they work together and they shift this big concrete block off of the storm drain opening and they descend. And at first, it's quite frightening. It's scary. And at some point, the helper is like, I'm out of here. Like, I gotta go. But the dreamer sort of pushes on, and suddenly they descend down a ladder, and they discover, oh, it's not a scary haunted sewer at all. They move into this bigger space, and yeah, there are kind of ghosts at the margins and whatever. But then all of a sudden they pull this thing, and they realize it's an old theater. And they pull the curtain back, and behind the curtain is another theater. It's a kind of magic theater, and they're suddenly, of course, filled with like wonder. They super want to show this to people. They're like, oh, it's not scary down here at all. It's a magic theater, right? I am using the term magic theater, but the point is there's this abandoned theater, this quite wonderful, red velvet, very old school curtain kind of thing. Now, The immediate image that comes up there for me, if you're not familiar with it, is Steppenwolf, Herman Hesse Steppenwolf, which features the Magic Theater. But like, this is a pretty potent symbol. The dream goes on from there and sort of reinforces these themes to a great extent. But just looking at that thing, this is a client who has not really had access to this space and has wanted it so badly, right? And in fact, in relatively recent sessions, had sort of said, I think the thing is I have to stop being so concerned right now with exploring my inner world, and I need to focus on the external. And I was like, okay, like if that's, if that's the move that you're feeling, then that's the move you should make. And so, of course, again, we have a kind of, like a bit of a principle of effortless action. They let it go, and all of a sudden, right, they have this dream where they're allied. Now, sometimes in the dream life of clients and people doing the work, you'll see a kind of transition that occurs where what starts out as an antagonistic shadow figure gradually transitions from being a menacing to being helpful. So another of my clients had early dreams that involved sharks in the water. Sharks and crocodiles all the time. And then they more recently, in the middle, they had a dream where they were taking a boat out to an island to, I believe, golf with Jordan Peterson, if I remember correctly. And as they were boating, they saw somebody else, a very shadow kind of figure, come at them in another boat and hit them with the boat to knock them out of the boat into the water, and then they were concerned about sharks again. But in the most recent dream they were in water swimming with their arm around a shark. So they and the shark were, right, moving together. There was a transition in the shadow figure towards the helpful mode. This is the kind of befriending the shadow that we sometimes see in the work, where gradually something goes from being menacing an other to gradually becoming a kind of ally in the work. Well, there's nothing off the bat indicating per se that in the dream that I heard yesterday that this was necessarily a shadow figure, although they were of the same, gender as the dreamer, so that's maybe something. But they were this younger figure, right, which might mark, a piece of themselves that sort of snapped off at that particular age. Not certainly impossible. Lots of kind of, household trauma and stuff during that period. But also may represent a kind of new potential, right? Normally new potential is represented with much younger children, babies and young children, as an instantiation, a symbolic instantiation of these like green shoots that are coming up in the psyche. But in this case, we've got the kind of younger kid that they're hanging around with in this state of play, right? Again, something that we've sort of discussed in session at great length, this question of like play. And the thing is, together we can move the block, because there's a block, and it's a concrete block. It's not a rock. It's not a natural object. It's a block. It's been placed there to block off the storm drain. What's a storm drain? A storm drain is, of course, an entry to the lower world, but it's also a place that surplus water goes when there are storms, right? That's what a storm drain is. Surplus water goes, and it's designed to prevent flooding, right? That's what a storm drain is. And so, okay, so what's a storm? A storm is, overhead is sort of like the skies, the gods, right, being angry. There tends to be a kind of masculine component to that very often, but not necessarily. And this is somebody whose like childhood household, right, had a lot of tension, parental tension. So when the gods are storming, and conventional association with water, with rain, of course, is emotion. It's tears, right? And so, like, the tears have nowhere to go. There's a block. But also, because there's a block, we can't get down here anymore. And the perception is it's haunted, right? It's a haunted space. It's spooky. It's haunted. What's haunted? Haunted is, well, there are things that are dead but not dead, right? There are things that are dead but not dead. They've died, but they're also quite active and possibly malevolent. So they move the block together, right? They're capable of moving it. And descending down, when he finally goes down the ladder, he finds out, oh, this isn't a shitty haunted sewer at all. It's a magic theater, right? It's a wonderful symbol. That's what I mean. It's really ripped from the textbook in that way. And I would add, quite encouraging. This is the sort of dream that one looks at when they drop and sort of says, good. Your efforts are beginning to be sort of cooperatively met, right? So we can think about the helper in this way too, right? That the unconscious has manifested this thing that's like, oh yeah, together we can do this. Me, as the ego, plus this additional principle can shift something, can shift the block, right? And go down into the place that is blocked, move into the unconscious, right? So we get the helper there. So the helper looks up to us, and the helper assists us. It acts, right? It acts in concert with us. Sometimes the helper, of course, is also something of an instigator figure. You can think of Toto in The Wizard of Oz, right? Toto really often kicks off the action in various ways, right? By grabbing things or doing things, or right? So Toto kicks off the action with, the school teacher, schoolwoman, but likewise, right, is the one who runs forward and pulls the curtain back to reveal the wizard, right? It's sort of an actor that moves that forward. Oh, we're up to 26 minutes again. Okay, hold on. I'm not used to recording these short bursts.